is me!
Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are absolutely diving into the deep end with a fascinating and comprehensive text titled The Hatred of the Apostle Paul, a complete KJV Bible study. Now, if you spent any time at all studying theology or church history, you already know that Paul is a controversial figure. But this text makes a really bold claim. It argues that the intense, centuries-long hostility directed at the Apostle Paul isn't just a matter of honest scholarly disagreement. It's not just some shifting theological debate. Instead, the author argues that what we are actually looking at is a highly coordinated spiritual war, and it's aimed directly at his gospel of grace. It is a really provocative angle, so let's unpack exactly how this study builds its argument.
Right off the bat, the source text poses a massive question. Why Paul? According to the study, Paul has faced an unprecedented, completely ferocious level of opposition. We're talking about relentless attacks not just in his own generation, but in literally every single generation since. Whether you consider yourself a theologian or you're just someone fascinated by history, you have to admit that understanding why this one single man became such a massive lightning rod offers a pretty incredible look into human belief systems. So we are going to explore this phenomenon together. The study essentially sets out to prove that this historic hatred isn't random. Rather, it's a desperate, highly targeted effort to completely silence the very specific message he carried to the world.
To get a sense of what this looks like today, the study outlines a barrage of modern accusations. If you look online, in academic papers, or even listen to certain pulpits, the claims are wild. People call him a flat-out liar who fabricated his entire Damascus Road conversion. Some literally go so far as to call him the Antichrist, claiming he completely corrupted the pure teachings of Jesus. You'll hear him labeled as a false, self-appointed apostle, or a misogynist, or a confused apostate. People even claim he's the founder of a totally invented, hijacked religion they call Paulianity. But here is the core thesis of this entire study. None of these claims are actually new. Not a single one. The text argues that these are just shiny, modern platforms for a very, very ancient hatred.
So what is actually driving all this vitriol? To get to the absolute root cause, the text points us directly to the words of Paul himself, specifically 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4. The study argues that if you want to understand the hatred of Paul, you have to realize this isn't an honest theological debate over ancient Greek translations. It is a spiritual assault. Paul wrote that if his gospel is hidden, it is hidden because an entity is actively, intentionally blinding human minds from seeing it.
The text identifies this god of this world specifically as Satan, but we aren't talking about a cartoon character with a pitchfork here. According to the study, this being possesses enormous power and malice, and he essentially organizes human culture, and more importantly, human religion, entirely around suppressing the knowledge of God. The author asserts that this entity's primary, number one strategy is keeping souls away from the concept of unearned forgiveness, the free grace of God. And how do you stop a message? You relentlessly discredit the messenger. To attack Paul, the study claims, is quite literally to attack the gospel itself.
What I find really fascinating here is the direct historical through-line the study draws. It essentially argues that if the Apostle Paul were alive right now, today, preaching the exact same message of free justification by faith alone, the exact same kind of people would hunt him down. Sure, the faces have changed, the platforms have shifted from ancient mobs throwing literal stones in the street to modern, sophisticated social media smear campaigns. But the underlying spirit driving those accusations, the text argues, it remains absolutely identical.
Now here is where the study makes a particularly interesting and maybe unexpected historical claim. It argues that Paul's most dangerous historical enemies were not the pagan Romans. They weren't secular philosophers laughing at him in Athens. Rather, they were devout, highly religious people. We're talking about people who genuinely, sincerely believed they were serving God by opposing him. The text calls this the synagogue spirit. It describes this as the extreme danger of weaponized religious tradition, where sincere religious zeal is deployed to suppress the gospel, all dressed up to look like faithfulness to God. To really highlight this kind of individual malice, the study points to a specific biblical figure, a guy named Alexander the Coppersmith. Paul actually names him directly in 2 Timothy, warning that Alexander greatly withstood our words. The text uses this Alexander as the ultimate historical archetype for modern opponents. Think of Alexander as the ancient equivalent of a dedicated anti-fan content creator. He perfectly represents those people today who dedicate massive amounts of their time, their energy, and their platforms to deliberately and professionally withstanding Paul's teachings, just making sure as few people as possible actually believe his message. And if you want to understand the sheer, terrifying scale of this ancient institutional hatred, the text brings up a stunning historical fact recorded in the book of Acts. Just look at this number, 40. More than 40 men literally banded together and bound themselves under a starvation curse. They took an oath to neither eat nor drink until they had successfully assassinated Paul. And you have to understand, this wasn't just some fringe mob of extremists acting alone. This plot had the tacit backing of the ultimate religious authorities of the day, the chief priests and the Sanhedrin. The study uses this to show that marginalizing and silencing Paul has historically been an official institutional priority. It's wild to think about.
But here is where we shift to the defense, and it's brilliant. This study argues that Paul was absolutely not caught off guard by any of this. In fact, it asserts that Paul completely anticipated every single modern accusation we see today right in his own lifetime, and he answered them preemptively. The text essentially frames his epistles as this masterful, airtight courtroom defense, systematically dismantling the claims of his critics point by point, thousands of years before they even thought to type them out online.
To build its case for the divine origin of Paul's gospel, the text relies heavily on specific scriptural citations. Pointing to passages like Galatians chapter 1, it notes that Paul absolutely, fiercely certified his gospel was not some human invention. He explicitly stated that he didn't receive it from a man, nor was he taught it in some seminary, but he received it by direct revelation from the risen Jesus Christ. So the study makes a logical conclusion. To say Paul contradicts Jesus, which is a popular claim today, is actually to say Jesus contradicts himself.
Which brings us to a really crucial point. We have to address this very loud, modern accusation that Paul went rogue and founded a brand new religion called Paulianity. The study emphatically refutes this from top to bottom. It notes Paul's own absolute, sheer horror at the very idea of believers calling themselves followers of Paul. Remember in 1 Corinthians, he actively fights against this, insisting on knowing nothing among them save Jesus Christ and him crucified. The text argues that claiming Paul created a cult of personality is an artificial, completely false inversion of the actual historical truth.
Okay, but what about the original 12 disciples? Did they reject Paul? That's a huge talking point for critics. Well, the text tackles this head-on by pointing directly to Peter, the undeniable chief of those original 12. In 2 Peter, he leaves zero room for doubt. Look at this list. Peter explicitly calls Paul our beloved brother. He openly acknowledges that Paul's wisdom was divinely given. He literally places Paul's letters on the exact same level of divine authority as the other scriptures. And finally, Peter issues a really stark warning to those who are unlearned and unstable against twisting Paul's words. That is a massive endorsement.
And it wasn't just a verbal endorsement either. As the study points out in Galatians chapter 2, James, Peter, and John, the literal pillars of the Jerusalem church, publicly gave Paul and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship. Now we need to understand the context here. This wasn't just a grudging nod across the room. In the ancient world, giving the right hand of fellowship was a legally and socially binding covenant gesture. It meant full partnership. It meant equal apostolic standing. They were officially and publicly recognizing his authority.
Now let's look at some physical, historical evidence against the whole idea that Paul was just a fraud or a grifter. The text tallies up his physical sufferings, and this number is staggering. 195. 195 individual lash strokes. That's 5 separate sets of 39 lashes that Paul endured from religious authorities. And that is just the whipping.
That's on top of being beaten with Roman rods, a stoning that literally left him for dead outside a city, and multiple terrifying shipwrecks. The study presents a really stark, undeniable historical argument here. Absolutely no liar and no power-hungry religious entrepreneur willingly accepts 195 lash strokes across their own back for a story they made up. It just doesn't happen.
Which leads the author to raise a deeply logical question. What did Paul actually have to gain from all this? Think about his life before his conversion. Saul of Tarsus was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He had impeccable religious pedigree, massive social standing, and a brilliant, comfortable career ahead of him. And he willingly traded all of that elite status for chains, grinding poverty, and a back covered in scars, which he proudly called the marks of the Lord Jesus. The text argues that a man only makes a trade like that if he has encountered something overwhelmingly, undeniably real. So, pulling it all together, the study concludes that these thousands of years of continuous war against Paul is ultimately an attempt to hide a very specific, beautiful treasure. Paul calls it the mystery, the incredibly liberating truth that a broken sinner can be justified completely and permanently by faith alone in the finished work of Christ. In other words, the text claims the true target of all this hatred is the concept of free grace. It's the radical idea that humanity's slate is wiped entirely clean simply by believing, without ever needing to earn it through religious works. The text asserts that this free grace is exactly what the God of this world is so utterly desperate to obscure.
As we wrap up, the document leaves us with a really powerful plea. It urges students to rightly divide the word of truth. It draws a firm conclusion that the war against Paul is, in reality, a war against the gospel of grace itself, and therefore to reject Paul is to reject God's specific message for this current era. The text warmly invites the reader to look past all the modern online noise, all the academic debate, and simply find the unsearchable riches of Christ right there in Paul's letters.
We want to leave you with this final thought to consider today. Based on the detailed historical context and the textual evidence presented in this study, you have to ask yourself, is the relentless, centuries-old hatred of the Apostle Paul truly about the man himself? Or is it actually a targeted, highly coordinated reaction to the radical, completely unmerited grace he relentlessly preached to the world? It is a fascinating perspective for sure, and one that absolutely forces us to look at both ancient history and modern criticism in a completely new light. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.